and today's a very significant day, certainly all throughout the Caribbean and really the diaspora, because it recognizes the end of slavery, certainly the proclamation and the implementation. It's 190 years since the ending of slavery. So it's a major celebration. As you know, we went through 250 years or so of dehumanization and degradation and every possible aspect of the Holocaust or Mahafa that we can talk about, including the displacement of, I don't know, 40 million people out of the continent and the death of so many in such dire circumstances, from the continent, traveling across the Atlantic, and on the slave plantations, et cetera. But, it's important to focus, I think, on our emancipatory efforts. And I think that's what's important in the long run. Because the ending of slavery didn't come about because of the generosity of the people who had enslaved us. It came about because of our continued efforts to free ourselves. And of course, one of the major efforts that was successful was, of course, the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution, we started, was it something like 1791 with the rebellion against Napoleon's army, and that fight continued until 1804 when we had our first Black Republic there in the Caribbean with a major success against the French and against the British and all of those who would subjugate us. And I may ask you to jump in there and give us a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, because we're going to go on from that to the current situation in Haiti. But Haiti was representative of so many efforts, whether they were in Brazil with the Quilombos and Zumbi, with Zanga in Mexico, and with others in Colombia, and with the Maroons in Suriname, the so-called Bush Negroes, and the same thing was going on in Jamaica with people like Nanny and Sam Sharp and George William Gordon, etc. Well, can you fill us in on some of those revolutionary efforts that took place? Because they're very, very significant in terms of our history, because it gives us a foundation of the knowledge that we struggled and struggled and struggled and did achieve our emancipation.
Yes, sir. The Haitian Revolution taking place in Haiti. Haiti was part of a bigger island, if you like, that was at the time called Hispaniola. And what happened was a priest, a traditional African priest, began the struggle on the 22nd of August, 1791. This priest, I've seen the name Bookman Dotti used in some of the literature. And some people say that he may not even have been Haitian. There's a theory that he could have come from Jamaica. And on the 22nd of August, he kicked off what was going to become the Haitian Revolution. But apparently, the 8 days before, some people say the 14th of August, he led a traditional African celebration to invoke an ancient African deity associated with war called Ogun.
That's a tradition.
Yeah. And the idea was to resurrect the kind of energy and power of this ancient African war deity. And after 8 days of invocation, stuff kicked off on the 22nd of August, 1791. Now, Haiti at the time was under the rule of the French. But the French, they were going through their own revolution. And the historians talk about the French Revolution. They big it up and they big it up and they big it up. But the French were not necessarily friendly to the idea of their enslaved Africans kicking off. So the French did everything that they could do to suppress it. Eventually, Boukman Dutty is captured and killed. He's out of the picture. And leadership of the revolution passed to General Toussaint Louverture. And he becomes a great revolutionary leader. And according to the great Trinidadian scholar, C.L.R. James, he worships this guy, Toussaint Louverture. He was captured and starved to death in a French prison. And then the revolution was completed in late 1803 under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines orders the Europeans, invaders, a lot of them to be executed. So the 22nd of February, 1804, a whole series of executions took place. And the significance of that is whenever Africans take power, they don't usually make the other side pay the way that Jean-Jacques Dessalines did. And so Europeans have always been upset with Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and there's been a kind of policy to starve the Haitians out ever since. Meanwhile, having fought the French, in fact, 2 French invasions, other Europeans realizing, but wait a minute, the French are out of the way. Maybe we can snatch Haiti and re-enslave the Haitians. So the Spanish tried and were beaten. The English tried and were beaten. And Haiti becomes independent, and a consequence of their independence is their new ruler, King Henri Christophe, builds a series of forts across Haiti. The most important one is a building called Citadel Henry, which is a hilltop castle. It's the largest fort in the Western Hemisphere. And that was conceived of by the previous ruler, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, as a series of 40 forts that were going to be built across Haiti to stop the French from coming back. And it worked. The French didn't come back. So Haiti became an inspiration to Black people in the Western Hemisphere that you can revolt, you can overthrow your slave owners. You've got to remember the French, the English, the Spanish are amongst the 3 most powerful European nations. You can stand up to them and beat them. You can pull off the most important piece of diasporan architecture. Better than that, some people say the most important piece of 19th century architecture, full stop. And the Haitians did all of this, and they freed their country. Now, the French since came up with a way of getting them to pay reparations, which has impoverished Haiti to this day. But the most important fact is the Haitians pulled it off.
Yeah, I think that's something that, that we can all be very proud of, because it's the high point, shall we say, of our rebellion as a people in the diaspora. And we've mentioned, some of the others in Jamaica and elsewhere, because there was revolution in every one of the islands and in every one of the enslaved communities. And we've all now, achieved independence in that sense. Certainly since the 60s, I think everybody has been been independent, certainly with a flag and an anthem. But our problems, in some sense, have still persisted. So we fought against oppression, we fought against dehumanization, and we fought for freedom. The question is, how is freedom going to be expressed? And is it going to be expressed in a way that is consistent with us and our thoughts and ideas, or is it going to be expressed in a similar way to the people who oppressed us? Because this is one of the problems I think that we are faced with as African people, is that the hegemony of the world still resides within the European groups of people, certainly within the United States primarily at this point in time, because as you mentioned, at the point in time that we're discussing with the Haitian Revolution, the empires were the French, and the British and the Spanish. But now, of course, we have the American Empire, which has taken over, at least since 1945, the end of World War II, from the British, because the British were decimated and so on during that war with the Germans. So we've had that degree of hegemony now transferred to the United States of America, but the concepts have not changed, and it's the European concept of domination of other peoples and other cultures and other regions of the world. So that there's a worldwide, shall we say, domination by Europe, and especially also at this point in time, by the United States of America. And going back to the Caribbean, so to speak, it manifests itself in what has happened there. To, for example, Haiti, in terms of the domination, the invasion, by the United States. I don't remember the exact years and so on, but I think one of them may have been in 1932 or some period like that. Installation of dictatorships like people like Papa Doc, the invasions and attempted invasions in Cuba, certainly the rule of people, like Batista, and the takeover by a nationalist, such as Fidel Castro. And then the attempt of the United States to unseat Castro over time, the Bay of Pigs, and so on and so forth. And then all of these other attempts to dominate the area. We just mentioned Cuba. There's the same thing with Venezuela. The Venezuelans had, if you will, a socialist approach to the way wealth should be handled and distributed, and certainly was very helpful to places like Cuba and other places too, because I know that they had an oil deal, for example, with Jamaica and other places, because Venezuela was oil rich and they were willing to share, which is something that the United States does not do. It doesn't share anything with anybody. It gathers everything up for themselves. So that America, the United States of America has supported regime change, over the years, and when it can't achieve regime change, it is, marginalize people with sanctions. Like there's still sanctions against Cuba. I think it was Obama who lifted the sanctions for a short period, but they're reinstituted by Biden, etc. And Trump, and the same thing has happened with Venezuela. Although I think recently with an oil shortage, they reached out to Venezuela to try to get some of Venezuela's oil. And we see what's going on now with Guyana, where oil has been discovered off the coast, and again, the American oil companies are moving into that area, fomenting trouble with the neighbor, which is Venezuela, to Guyana. And all of this has happened. The same thing has happened in Bolivia, etc. When, quotes, leftist government has been in charge. So the United States has looked at the Caribbean as its backyard, and that it should have dominance over the area in terms of how the people, manifest their concept of freedom. So even though our ancestors have fought the enslavement and have achieved, quote, independence, they're still being subjugated to a very, very large extent by the hegemony specifically of the United States. And this is something that, we need to continue the fight because it's very real. And you can probably fill in some of the historical details. And, specifically, I think with Haiti in terms of the invasions that took place there by the United States government. As you know, similar things happened in terms of Puerto Rico and taking it over there, the so-called Dominican Republic, and how that came about as the other half of Hispaniola, which it was at that time. So there's all this fragmentation and invasion and regime change and sanctions that have taken place that still is preventing us from being free in terms of who we are as a people or how we see ourselves in terms of both our socioeconomic and political agendas, which we should be able to shall we say, determine for ourselves as independent people. Can you fill us in a little bit historically there in terms of the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, that has taken place over time with the U.S. hegemony? Because that brings us up to where Haiti is at the present time and what CARICOM, etc., which we want to get into that a little bit.
I'm not the person with that information. Here's why. I'm the Black history man. So what goes on in some of those other places, I've never really researched, other than the general what happens under American imperialism, the kind of thing that John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the 3 stages of how you overthrow a government. You get the president to take on a corrupt deal, and the idea is the deal will enrich the president at the expense of the citizens and will put the country further and further into debt. If the president doesn't step correctly and reject such a deal, you send in the jackals, and if the jackals don't pull off the job, you overthrow that government. And if a president of a country dies in an air crash or something like that, you know automatically the Americans did it. But the specific details of what happened in this country or that country, I don't have those details. All I've got is the general picture. But the topic area that I wanted to address it's the opposite side of what you're talking about. You're talking about the issues of what happens when imperialist powers control you economically. The other side of the argument is what Africans in the Americas did culturally. And to a very large extent, we've actually been successful in waging, if you like, cultural war, in Africanizing the countries that we now find ourselves in, and influencing the non-Africans in those countries in the direction of African culture. And that cultural struggle is also part of the resistance to mass enslavement, do you see? Now, what we did, though, we made the mistake of thinking that cultural struggle alone will win. It can influence, but if somebody else controls the purse strings, that's what you're talking about. Somebody else controls the purse strings. They've still got you, even if you win the cultural struggle. But I do think the extent of cultural struggle, the ability of Africans that have been through mass enslavement to resurrect so many aspects of African culture and make those aspects of African culture, the national cultures of the countries that they find themselves in, is actually a very inspirational story that, again, hasn't really been told. Or at least that's my opinion. What say you, sir?
Yeah, I think, that you're correct there. And the foundation of our, future development, in terms of our sovereignty and our identity, depends significantly on our cultural identity, over time, and our reconstruction, resurrection, or reaching back into history in terms of our traditions and our culture. As my dad said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, culture, and traditions is like a tree without roots. So there's no question that our autonomy as a people, our sovereignty as a people, has to be based on our cultural identity and ultimately cultural competence. The problem, as you say, and I think we're both, in some sense saying the same thing, is that our culture, even though we have reached back to in terms of its identification, it is still skewed because of the economic circumstances that still determines our behavior on a day-to-day basis, and short-term, even long-term, in terms of getting into debt and so on and so forth, and having to pay off this loan and that loan in order to be able to cope with the inequities of the economic system. And I think what happens then is I think in terms of culture, there's deep culture and there's superficial culture, and of course the two are normally linked, but I think they can be dissociated. And what I mean by that is that, okay, I like my rice and peas, I like my curry goat, and I like my jerk chicken, etc., etc. I like my reggae music, and so on. And if I'm a Rastafarian, I do certain things in a certain way. And over time, we have certain festivities and so on and so forth that are based on our cultural memories. But then there's the deeper aspect of the culture, which is really your belief system, and your tradition. And that has been assaulted over time and has been reinforced because of the dominance of a different cultural, political, ideological, religious system that have been pretty much enforced on us. For example, most of us are Christian or Muslim or involved in some version of Western religion, whether we call it Lutheranism or Protestantism or one of the other versions of that. And in some sense, and of course, this is also true of the continent itself, because there's been this assault over time that goes back, if you will, 1,000 years or more. So, that has been encroaching on our traditional beliefs and our traditional culture. And because the basis of who we are as an African people, and gets to a concept that you and I have talked about in some sense, and I was just talking about to somebody else. Who or what is an African? I mean, we don't define ourselves simply by the pigmentation of our skin. And we don't define ourselves simply by the fact that we were born on the continent, or we're not born on the continent, we're born in the diaspora. So if we're not doing that, then what does it mean to be an African? And this is where we now get to, shall we say, our deep culture and our deep traditions, and our spirituality, because that is the difference, I think, basically between an African, if you will, and a European, if you will, or perhaps maybe you can say a non-African. But let's just say, because the African uh, sees creation, creativity, and the universe and divinity, and shall we say, nature, divinity, and humanity as a three in one, as a trinity that is part of a unity, not as separate things. So that we never had philosophy separate from theology or religion, and separate even from science, or separate from the way in which we lived on a day-to-day basis. And and I think this is of extreme importance, because the European, and let me just read something here, which encapsulates it better than I'm stuttering around it. And this is, I think this is somebody that you like too, Chukwunyere Kamalu, and it's his book, Foundations of African Thought. And he said that what the book is about is the idea, the main theme is the idea that the world is ordered according to a principle or doctrine of the coexistence and interaction of opposites on all levels of understanding, from the abstract to the concrete. This is the African perspective. It said the European has divided or polarized these opposites. On the most basic level, there's a division between spiritual and physical, between emotional and rational, between man and woman, and you can go on and on and on. So, there's the difference between, quotes, the European and other people, and they say they're civilized and other people are savages or whatever, and they're going to bring you civilization, when, of course, it's not true at all. And they make a big distinction between, self and other. Again, between gender, between men and women, as if to say we're not, part of the same thing, and have commonalities, etc., and are supposed to work together. So that is fundamental, I think, to our way of thinking, and to say that we're African. We do not, polarize the differences. We do not rationalize the differences as separate, but we understand them as part of the same thing. And you can go all the way back to Kemet and the cosmogony of Kemet, where Atum and Art or Atum Ra is the creative will is the will of the creator, and Atum out of himself creates Shu and Tefnut, which are the equivalent of fire and water, if you will. Those are the main fundamental principles of creation. But Atum creates or comes out of himself Shu and Tefnut, and then what does he do? He embraces Shu and Tefnut. In other words, Shu and Tefnut are not different. It's a three in one. It's a trinity. One becomes two, but in becoming two, and they become three, and the three becomes one. You see, so this is a fundamental principle of what it means to be African. Now, we have identified that in ourselves, and yes, we're going to have to deal with that extensively. Go ahead, Robin.
And this is why I think we should be looking at our culture from the perspective of a great deal of success. If you were to look at Caribbean families and African-American families, especially in the South, you'll find that it's very common for people to raise children who are not, strictly speaking, you know, their son or daughter. So what will happen is we would spend a large amount of time being raised by an uncle, being raised by an aunt, being raised by a very distant relative, or being raised by someone that you're not related to at all, but you really are a part of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And that is evidence of embracing something bigger than you.
Mm-hmm.
And so what a lot of the African American sociologists, people like Robert Staples and so on, they talk about what they call the strengths of the Black family. And one of them is this lack of difference between male and female roles, to the point where very large numbers of Black men can cook. Very large numbers of Black men are hands-on raising children. Very large numbers of Black men play stepdaddy to other people's children. No one really talks about this, with the exception of Robert Staples. So again, these are examples of our culture withstanding slavery and actually producing results. For Black people that live in Britain, how a lot of us ended up coming to Britain, it was distant relatives staying with distant relatives when they came to Britain. And that those bonds that connected you to another person were considered strong enough that, yeah, you come and stay with us. And you stay with us and we'll look out for you until you can get on your own feet. Do you see? And these are examples of the kinds of strengths. Similarly, when it comes to what you're calling shallow aspects of culture, as opposed to non-deep aspects of culture, when you cross-examine those shallow aspects, you find they're not actually shallow. There's a reason why, if you go into a European bookshop and go to the music department, there's loads and loads of books on jazz. There's a reason why. Because we produced it, a lot of people think, well, jazz is not that important. It's just music. It's just entertainment. No, it's not. It's high art. And that's why you will get loads of books on Louis Armstrong, loads of books on Duke Ellington, loads of books on Count Basie, loads of books on Charlie Parker, loads of books on Dizzy Gillespie. Because what they put down was high art. Same thing, you mentioned rice and peas and jerk chicken. Caribbean cuisine, what the African Americans call soul food, what other people call Creole cuisine, is amongst the best in the world. If you consider, from a European perspective, they will tell you that the best cuisine in the world is French. They will also concede that Creole cuisine is just as good. They'll try and say it was the French who were behind it, but the fact that they've said it was just as good, what it is we need to look at the shallow aspects of our culture and cross-examine them to find that they're not shallow. There's a lot there. And our ability to sustain these things, our ability to retain these things, our ability to synthesize, where we would mix up mostly our culture, but with maybe a bit of Native American culture and serve it up as a package. A bit of African culture mixed in with a bit of Indian culture. By Indian, I mean people from India. Because a lot of Caribbean countries have got Indian populations as well. Mix it up, but it's mostly an African type of thing. These are great strengths. And the fact that we've been able to do this under overwhelming oppression, and these things shape our culture today. So if I speak to people from, sake of argument, Nigeria, if I speak to people from, sake of argument, Ghana, If I speak to people from sake of argument, Ethiopia, we can point out similarities in our culture. We really can. And if you look at what those of us descended from slavery went through, we shouldn't be able to point out any similarities because that should have all been destroyed. And it wasn't. And the position that I'm coming with is we have to see these things as a strength because the way we deal with each other, the way we deal with other people, it's still being shaped by the deep African philosophical concept of person, of divinity, of nature. It's still being shaped by that. And it's 2024. And the enslavers weren't able to destroy that. So even Black people that are under Christianity, I mean, you've been to a Black church, I've been to a Black church. You see people getting into the spirit. As you know, that doesn't happen in European settings. Those are African traditional things that have become a part of the culture. Do you see? And we should celebrate that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. But the thing is that there is difficulty not simply in maintaining that, as you know, and you pointed out the difficulty of having maintained some of it. But not only is there the difficulty of maintaining that, but there's also the difficulty of identifying it as a genuine philosophical and spiritual perspective that is legitimate in terms of human endeavor over time, and is actually the basis for civilized living. This is not being accepted. And part of the problem, of course, is even our own intellectuals are schooled within the Western and the European system and identify, therefore, with this concept of individualism and materialism that is so central to the European perspective of life. And that spirituality is not even really accepted as a part of life. It's really the physical material aspect that is honored. And as we have said, previously, it's all about, scientific materialism and, shall we say, teasing out the secrets of nature by putting nature on the rack, which takes you back to Descartes and Francis Bacon of the 17th century. That's the beginning of the scientific perspective of the material approach. And as you know, that Europeans and the Western world have not solved the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Well, consciousness is not a hard problem at all. Consciousness is basic. Consciousness is spirit. Consciousness is soul. And this is part of who we are as a people, and part of our difference. And this needs to be looked at from the philosophical, theological perspective. And that's what I'm saying in terms of the deep aspect of culture as opposed to the superficial. Clearly, we have maintained, certain aspects of our culture under great difficulty. But then when it comes to reconstructing our societies after our independence, we're still trying to do it in large part based on European concepts of what an economic system should be, what a political system should be, what a social system should be, what quote religion should be. And all of those things are subsumed in a way of life, an African way of life that was a tradition for us over time, over 10,000 years. And again, we can always go back to Kemet and Nubia and so on and verify that. And it has come forward to us. Whether it came, whether it's you look for it in the Dogon, or you look for it in the Yoruba, or you look for it in the Akan, or in the Congo, etc., or in the Bantu, with Ubuntu. I mean, all of it is there. And let's fast forward again to Pan Africanism, because it's one of the things that we talk about. How do we shape our African nations in the 21st century in terms of what it means to be an African and what it means to unite Africans across the globe, because we are now a global people, as my dad has identified us. Back in the day, he said there were 400 million of us in terms of Africans on the continent and abroad. Now it's probably 1.3 billion or so, or maybe we might be 1.5 at this point. But whatever the numbers are, to make us a force, we have to identify who and what it is that makes us African. And the deep structure of our culture is what really makes us Africans. We have not identified that enough and used it as the basis for our political system, our economic system, and even, shall we say, our religious social system, because of the incursions of other religions on us. Because again, the African tradition and culture, it has always been a way of life. You take your religion, if you will, to the field with you, or you take it to your workplace, and you take it to your entertainment when you're going out to have fun, whether it's in the bar or whatever the festivity is. You don't leave your religion, in the church, as you mentioned, that there's a difference in terms of how we worship, shall we say. So in many African languages, there's no word for religion, and there was no word back in Kemet for religion. Everything is a way of life, and the way of life is a unity between that Trinity that we just talked about, our source, whatever we want to call it, God. Now we can call it the unified field, nature, or whatever you want to call it. You can call them gods, or you can call them nature or neteru, and our humanity. And all of that is an integral relationship of functioning on a day-to-day basis. So, and we've abandoned that in some sense. And again, getting back, I think, to what you're talking about in terms of John Perkins and the hegemony of Europe and so on and so forth. I think every time we've had leaders who have tried to take us back in that direction, and certainly get rid of the hegemony of France or of the United States at this point in time, they've been subverted in terms of regime change, or they've been assassinated. But I do have a problem also with our political and intellectual leadership trying to define who we are through European concepts. And we've found that, for example, we'll get into this deeper at some point in time, but for example, with Kwame Nkrumah, with the definition of African socialism. Well, that's because he was a socialist, and he felt that, Marx and Engels really defined social structure for all time. But you find it in the European sense. European social structure is based on the class differences, and that goes back to the landed gentry and feudalism. That does not have an existence, a historical existence in Africa. So socialism itself as a solution to the class problem does not apply to Africa. Then you see what's the name from Tanzania, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. He went a little better in terms of the direction of what he considered African socialism to be really Ujamaa, the collective work and responsibility and so on. And that's what he proposed. And then you can go a little further to Kaunda in Zambia, etc., and he speaks of African humanism. So we've had movements in those directions, but they've not really been able to concretize, shall we say, a full ideology, a Pan-African ideology, that embraces our traditions philosophically and theologically, as well as sociopolitically over time. And it's all there in terms of our culture, because we have had civilized living for thousands upon thousands of years. And I maintain that Europeans have not had civilized living, because they've always been with each other and with the rest of the world. Go ahead, please.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head, sir. But I think the issue is, what has crippled our modern Black nations has been the economic control being outside of those nations. And when the economic control is outside of the nations, the power of money can be used to compel people to act against their culture. And this is why I think in a previous session, we discussed the idea, and I raised the possibility that in the same way that Cheikh Anta Diop, or Diop as they pronounce it in France, revolutionized history, in the same way that Frantz Fanon revolutionized the teaching of psychology, we haven't produced someone to revolutionize the teaching of economics so that we can chart a way to not be in the stranglehold of Western capitalism. We haven't produced a scholar who has come with a strategy, with an understanding that has completely revolutionized the way we look at it. And that's why I say that one of the areas that we really do have to advance our thinking, we have to produce a Diop of economics, and not for economics for Black people living as minorities in somebody else's country, but an economics for Black people who run the state apparatus that enables those people to escape from the stranglehold of Western capitalism, the stranglehold of Western capitalism and its debts, the stranglehold of the jackals, the economic hitmen, and so on and so forth. We haven't produced such an intellectual yet, as far as I'm aware. And I think it would be interesting to find out, have we produced such an individual? If so, where's their work? And what can we do to popularize their work?
Well, I would say this, that in a pragmatic sense, I think that has been produced. I think my dad produced that in terms of showing what we could do with unity and the contributions from everybody within that particular grouping or organizational structure, pooling their resources. And this is that whole idea of social entrepreneurship, which certainly he championed, before it became popular, if you will. And this was a group economics. And certainly he wasn't an economist in the classical sense of going to school, for that. But in the pragmatic sense, I think this is what he produced, and the pooling of resources by individuals, within a community, within an organizational structure, and whatever the economic venture is, then that benefits the community, the other individuals in the community. Therefore, it's going to be supported by the other individuals in the community. And then they can have another economic venture that that one builds on the other one and one supports the other one. And I think you see that over time, shall we say, in the Jewish communities, where if, you have one type of expression. Let's say it's bagels, that's being made by the Jewish entrepreneur. So everybody, who is Jewish, buys bagels, from that guy. And then, the people who make yarmulkes, then the people who buy bagels will deal with the tailors that make the yarmulkes, et cetera, et cetera. So that you have this sort of community organization of your economics. And of course, this in some sense is the basis of socialism, although socialism is based on class, whereas what we're talking about is an economic system that's based on group identity, whatever your group identity is. And again, like, it can be Jewish, it can be Indian. We see that with Indians and Pakistanis, let's say, in the United States or some other places. And you see that they sort of corner, a certain aspect of economics. And then that spreads itself out. Look at Chinese and Chinatown. You see they corner a certain thing. Chinese, that it may have started with Chinese food, or it may have started with the laundry, or it may have started with some other activity that the group did, and then they spread it out once they develop expertise in certain other areas. Then they develop
Can I jump in there, sir?
or the dentist, et cetera, and the reverse of that is that a dollar does not spend 5 minutes in the African American community or most of our Black communities, because most of the businesses are by somebody else. And that's the problem that we have, is the group identity problem, which is the basis of an economic structure that will bring wealth to the community. Go ahead, Robin. Yeah, I just wanted to finish.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No disagreement with anything that you've said. Yeah, I support everything you say, but here's the issue. What you're producing here works for Black people who are minorities in somebody else's country. Essentially, it's a way of building community economics and collective economics. The question is, what's the program for an independent country when you've got economic hitmen on your case, jackals on your case, people prepared to kick off a civil war on your case, and they've already got you into debt? What's the program there? Who is the intellectual who can see a way out of that? Because if there isn't a way out of that, you end up having to play the game, even if you don't want to play the game. Your people end up having to play the game, even if you don't want them to play the game, because no other vision has been put on the table that is realistic to help a country to resist.
I would say this, that the problem of the economic hitman, of course, is real, and this is what has bedeviled Africa since its independence, and if you will, also the diaspora in terms of the Caribbean and Latin America. And we've talked about Haiti, we've talked about Cuba, we've talked about Venezuela and Bolivia and so on. Those are cases in point. And of course, we know the coup against Kwame Nkrumah, CIA involvement, we know the murder of Lumumba, and so many others, the involvement of the jackals. The solution is not so much an intellectual solution, that we need some genius to tell us what to do, because it's really quite commonsensical. because I think we've done it as we just mentioned in terms of community development in different places in the diaspora, and we've tried to do it in different places in Africa. The only way in which it can be successful, and if we look at history in terms of the development outside of the Euro-American hemisphere, is in Russia, where Russia had the Iron Curtain, and they excluded all European influence during that period of time when they were developing themselves. They borrowed whatever it was they needed from Europe in terms of their own development, but they didn't allow the Europeans to influence them in any way. And that obviously had to go all the way to the military aspect of it, because that's where the hitmen come in. If you look at China, China had the bamboo curtain. And China was a basket case up to Chiang Kai-shek and all of those people, because they were neoliberals or whatever you want to call them, from the time of the opium dens and so on that the Europeans used to control China with through Chiang Kai-shek and those puppets. And then we had the communist revolution, and they pulled down the bamboo curtain and said, we're not dealing with you at all. Out of our country, we're not dealing with you. And they could reverse engineer, as the Japanese did, reverse engineer whatever they needed to reverse. And that's the only way they could develop themselves. They had to exclude the economic hitmen. They had to exclude the traitors. I'm sure many of them were assassinated or whatever you want to call it, neutralized. Let's just use that word. I'm sure many who did not go along with the program were neutralized. So at some point in time, you say, and of course, Africa has not gone to this stage, because Africa is not Africa. It's a concept. Africa is 55 countries, so 55 countries can't work in unison unless they are a federated state. So there we are with the problem of African development. It's 55 countries that are held together by African Union Constitution that really says, we're not going to interfere too much in your affairs in terms of what you're doing. If you behave yourself right, you should have constitutional government, but, let's just be good neighbors kind of thing and so on and so forth. You go your way, I'll go my way. Pay a little dues if you will, but of course we know that the AU dues are paid by China or Europe or somebody else. So we do not have this structure of an Africa that my dad wanted, that Kwame Nkrumah wanted, as the Organization of African Unity in 1963 was far short of what Kwame Nkrumah and others, wanted. There was a compromise that was negotiated in Addis and so on, and that's still bedeviling us. The nationalism and the heady wine of a flag and a national anthem, and I guess the ability to loot the national purse in the interests of certain elites. And there we have the corruption and the nepotism, and where's that country where the guy has been in charge for 40 years? Is it Equatorial Guinea or is it Togo or one of those places? I mean, it's ridiculous. But these things exist, and that's our problem at the present time.
Well said, sir.
Well, I think we're kind of, we haven't solved the problem, obviously, and you and I are not going to solve the problem. But I think we've pointed out the problem, because as you're saying that we need a clear economic pathway to do what it is that we need to do with our own resources, and so that we can develop ourselves, certainly at this point in time, sustainably. And again, we have to say sustainably at this point in time because of the climate crisis, etc., which is based on European industrialization and the use of fossil fuels, and it's brought us to this crisis. And you know, how do we change all this? Even if we talk about reparations for the damage to us, we have to repair the system. We have to come up with a new system. Europe has to come up with a new system. We have to come up with a new system. And quite frankly, we're in it together. But I'm not sure that that's understood at the present time. I think America and Europe still wants their hegemony, but we are in it together. Any last words?
Well said, sir. Well said. It's a discussion that we need to keep having, because this is, in my opinion, the biggest weakness of the Afrocentric Pan-African thing. What's the model for an independent country to advance when you're up against hitmen and jackals?
Yes, you're right, and that's the test for us in the future. If we don't find that particular solution, we'll be totally looted, and you know, physical resources have a limit. So they can take all the cobalt out of the Congo, or platinum, or diamonds out of South Africa, etc., etc. At some point in time, and we'll be, you know, thrown away. We left it holes in the ground, and destroyed our communities. So we have to find that solution. Once again, it's got a great discussion, and we look forward to next time.